Thanks. Oh, sorry, honey. My dog's here to help.
Oh, I love dog assistants. They're the best.
Just there.
Hi, honey. Welcome to the podcast, sweetie. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 9 of Name of Pod. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming back my dear friend Alastair Gray, who I am happy to say will be joining me from time to time moving forward. So I'm pretty excited about that. Hello, Alastair. Welcome
Hello.
back.
Nice to be back.
So we had a lot of fun doing our first episode together. We talked about movie soundtracks and music because we love to talk about music, and that is a typical conversation for the two of us. But I like that we decided that we would like to share some more of the types of conversations that you and I typically have. And we do tend to cover quite the array of topics in our conversations, which I love. So today, we decided we're going to be discussing some very interesting differences between our two countries and concerning issues that our respective lawmakers would consider to be either off the table or on the table. Because while our countries do have quite a bit in common, we're also very different in many ways, and especially concerning some of the issues that we want to talk about today. So I'm just going to dive right into what is historically the most off the table issue in the United States, gun control. Now, while we did recently pass some of the most comprehensive gun legislation in 30 years, I believe roughly 30 years, there's still too many loopholes, and different states can do different things, and there's still a lot of unfettered access and really relatively easy access to all sorts of assault weapons that probably shouldn't be widely available. But what's interesting to me about this is that when we're talking about issues that are on the table versus off, is that it kind of blows my mind a little bit that we have lawmakers here in the US who are finding it more important to ban drag queen story hours than assault rifles, which has been expertly pointed out by several awesome folks over the past week. All sorts of news people and even comedians are making jokes about this because it is a joke. It shouldn't be a thing, but there are a few people that are trying to bring it to the table. Senator Warnock, right here in Georgia, where I currently live, he's brought it up. He started addressing it in Congress over the past week, and also Governor Gavin Newsom of California has been trying to begin a state coalition that would maybe hopefully take some steps to do something about the access to these weapons and gun violence in this country. So, Alastair, this is an interesting one for us because this is a huge problem in this country, but what's it like for you guys?
Well, for us, certainly one of the big differences between the US and the UK, is probably a lot of your listeners know, is that, well, I mean, we don't, generally speaking, we don't have the same sort of constitution. We don't have a Bill of Rights in the way that we do. And so obviously we don't have a constitutionally protected right to bear arms. So we have had at times some degree of, I mean, it's not illegal to own a gun technically, but it's unlikely to ever be something like a handgun. It's never really going to be an automatic weapon. It will be a hunting rifle, something like that. Maybe you're part of a shooting club, maybe you enjoy hunting, something like that.
Right.
But the idea that someone would sort of be a gun collector, that somebody would own guns because they have a right to own guns, and certainly the idea that sort of someone would own guns in case the government comes to get them someday, like that's not something that we have here. Although again, like I want to be careful about that, because of course there's different kind of there's different principles at work, I think, in America than in England. Like the reason why the Second Amendment exists is probably important to think about. And certainly, I mean, I've spent lots of time thinking about this. I have no specific objection to the Second Amendment. I have no specific objection to the ownership of guns. I forget where I heard it recently, but somebody in an interview said that if the issue was framed as gun safety rather than gun control, then it might be easier to talk about it. But I think the idea for most people of control means the state trying to prevent the individual from owning firearms, or the state trying to regulate and control how the individual owns and what the individual can own. Right. And then you look at the wording of the Second Amendment, like to some extent, it sort of seems to be, well, if some sort of foreign power or any kind of power that is sort of trying to wrest control from the people tries to do so, well, that's the reason for owning and bearing firearms fundamentally. Right. So, I mean, I guess in a way, it's sort of like, well, better to have them and not need them than need them and not have them.
Right.
But
which would be one thing, right? Like to have them and not need them is, I would think, would be the ideal, right? And to your point too about, I mean, I was raised in a family where, yes, people go hunting, people shoot action pistol for sport, like moving target action pistol events, and I was taught pretty early on to respect a firearm, to know how to make sure that it was not loaded, to never ever point it at anyone, even if you knew it wasn't loaded. I don't have a problem with people responsibly owning guns. That's I'll just be very clear about that. But and I feel like you and I agree on that point. But the problem I have is that right now it is too easy for just anyone to go buy essentially, I mean, let's just call it what it is, a weapon of mass destruction at a gun show or something, with no background checks, or there's still these loopholes that are trying to be closed, but we're not quite there yet. And it's disappointing. Some of the most common sense things that are being proposed, and I do believe this to be common sense, not like a one side or the other sort of thing, but it's like, hey, maybe you need to have a license to own this thing. I mean, you have to have a license to drive a car, right? So,
yeah.
There's a waiting period. You can't just walk in and buy it that day, because wait, why do you need it right this second? And red flag laws that would, if someone's been, because background checks would be part of that, and that's where the red flag law would come in, right? So, if someone has a history of violence, and no, we're not, you can't have a gun. It's just, I mean, this is like stuff that could really just help. and it won't solve every single problem, but just spitballing here, but I really think it would help. I just think this is common sense kind of stuff.
I mean, a lot of those things seem like reasonable points to make, especially I was thinking when you made the point about how we don't really, at least in America, because I'm mindful that we're talking about differences between our countries, but one thing I think we have in common is that no one in England is trying to argue that we shouldn't need to take a driving test and have a driving license in order to be able to drive a car.
Right.
I mean, in England, we're allowed to drive a car on private land at any age without a license, if it's private. But I mean, that would be like if you've got like a 12-year-old and you want to teach, if you're a farmer, you've got a 12-year-old, you want to teach them how to drive a tractor, you can do that, right? And that idea that it's private land, you can kind of do what you want on it. But if you want to drive a car on a public road, you need to be, I think the age is 16 here, and then you take the test, and then you have a license. And I think like I actually briefly brought up the text of the Second Amendment. So I was thinking like, if it was the right of the people to keep and drive cars rather than arms, then it is possible you'd have people now saying we shouldn't have to take a test because we have a right to drive the car. I mean, it's difficult to pose counterfactuals in that kind of way because we don't need to be asking. But it's certainly there's some alternate universe somewhere where there's people saying the government can't take away our cars. But my only point there, I don't mean to ridicule the people. What I mean to say is that actually the fact that that's enshrined in the Constitution suggests that at least at one point in US history, that was considered something so important that it needed to be put into words, and that there have clearly been opportunities to. I mean, my understanding is that actually the interpretation of that amendment has changed over the centuries and over the decades.
Absolutely.
And the idea that it means that an individual now has the right to keep whatever guns they want.
Yeah.
Relatively new interpretation. Dating back only a few decades.
Pretty
because,
much.
I mean, I'm not being a lawmaker myself, I don't know, or constitutional scholar, I don't know whether this counts. But looking at the text, it seems like it could be argued that it doesn't necessarily guarantee the individual right to have a gun in your house, but rather access to guns should you need them. So you would have a sort of communal storage place or something like that, run by the community, that is a privately owned but sort of communally owned facility that stores firearms should they be needed.
Like if the zombie apocalypse happens, you have every right to go to your buddy's farm and grab all the stuff and go for it. Save humanity, Like,
That's why you have zombie apocalypse movies largely in America and not England, because in England we don't have access to guns. We just have to hunt or run away from them. Although 28 Days Later was pretty good.
That just made me think of Shaun of the Dead, because in Shaun of the Dead they're beating the zombies with cricket bats. You're right, they don't have guns. And records,
We have to be more creative here when the apocalypse comes. When the raiders come for our
get out the pool sticks. Oh, when they beat them with the pool cues at the pub. Yeah.
But I guess, I mean, you could argue that maybe it's because we've had a standing army in this country for longer than America has existed as a country. I mean, obviously, I don't mean to say that there have been people on the land for millennia, but when it comes to actually the United States of America as a kind of legal nation, we have had an army longer than you have been a nation, so we don't need that, as it were. And so maybe that's part of it. I'm not sure, but obviously, the idea that we as individuals should, in England, be able to own firearms has never really been something. I don't even know if it's been a political issue at all, but I mean, certainly it's never been something that's been discussed in our parliament or really written about in the papers. And even our right wing, I mean, it's interesting that one of the more recent critics of American gun policy was Piers Morgan. And people in America saw that as sort of quite left wing. Now, to us, Piers Morgan is sort of the archetypical like right wing loudmouth.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you say that, because I am of two minds about him, because one, I don't agree with a lot of the things that he says, but he has surprised me many times with certain things that he said. And yeah, I mean, here, of course, he would be considered, for the most part, to be, yeah, fairly conservative.
Yeah.
But some of the stuff that he says is considered a bit liberal in this country. And I like being surprised by people like this, because I find them interesting. I'm like, at least I'm not going to get bored, because sure, I don't have to agree with you on everything, but when I see that a person has that type of dichotomy where it's like, okay, I can tell that you're actually thinking about things. You're not just going with one side or the other, to say. But that it's like, oh no, you just actually have your own opinions, and some of them are over here and some of them are over there. And I almost kind of wish more people would think that way.
I think
I can't believe I just kind of complimented but I mean, he's an interesting person.
Certainly when it comes to sort of the political left and the political centre, they tend to be fairly similar wherever you go. But the political right is different from country to country, because it depends on the conditions of the country. So, for example, I mean, this is to the best of my knowledge, in countries like, say, the Netherlands, the political right is closer to sort of a liberal in the more philosophical sense of the word.
Oh.
Free speech, free association, anti-monarchy, that kind of thing. Whereas in England, because we have a monarchy, we had a very strict class system for a long time. So our right wing often is like not hostile to that. Sometimes it's not sort of overly supportive of that, and sometimes it supports reform to some extent. But then what you find is, like, you're more likely to find that, say, the English left and the American left will have a lot in common than the English right and the American right.
Yeah, and I find that interesting too, because when you say specifically that, our quote unquote left sides would have more in common than our right quote unquote sides, politically speaking, that I think it kind of speaks to a certain kind of like a global idea of, I guess, for lack of a better word, that kind of just slightly liberal, at least, if you want to call it just left of center or whatever, sort of ideology that seems to be shared in a more communal sense, even globally, than, say, our more conservative politicians, who, while many of them may have a lot of the same ideologies, they're exercised and expressed in rather different ways. Would you agree?
Say that last part again.
That whereas the left, our center lefts are slightly more liberal, or seem to be more globally, have like a similar ideology, versus where our rights kind of don't, the more conservatives, where they express themselves, whereas they may have some similar ideologies, their messaging on them is very different.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, I think I agree, but the ideology would be sort of the most general, as is my understanding of conservatism, and it's a very broad political spectrum. As is my understanding, it's about sort of Uh, it's opposed to revolution. It's opposed to any sort of radical change. It's not
Right.
necessarily opposed to change. It's
Right.
usually sort of, the right changes at the right times.
Mhm.
So for example, that there were a lot of conservatives in England who were eventually very supportive of same-sex marriage, but
Mhm.
they had to be won around to that position. And then there would have been other people who were supportive of it, but just didn't think that we as a culture had got to a place where we could actually implement it. I myself, I don't share that. I kind of look at human history over the last, well, mainly over the last 100 years, and say a lot of the time, the sort of most long-lasting changes happen when we've at a sort of tipping point, and there's not necessarily enough people who are on board, but nevertheless, something kind of tells us the change needs to be done, and we kind of feel like just making that change will then show enough people that actually it was a change that needed to happen. Like I don't know the statistics, but sort of around the time that the Civil Rights Act was passed, and the various different votes happened in the 60s in America, I don't know how many people actually supported civil rights, but nevertheless, it seemed to be something that they needed to bring in. Because if they didn't bring it in then it would take longer to come through. They bring it in 10 years later, then, the problems that we may have been having 10 or 20 years ago, America would be having now.
Right.
And said similar with something like gay rights, that eventually it sort of gets to a point where you think, when is the right time is a kind of slightly, it's an easy way to either just justify doing something without good reason or justify not doing something without good reason.
Right.
And instead you can say, look, we're
yeah.
going to do it, we're going to manage it, we're going to pay attention to it, but ultimately we need to get this started. Because, and this is my last point on the matter just here, is the last thing I want to say, is that just because it's consistent with, to not do so would be inconsistent with sort of basic ideas that the country has. And I think that with America, there was a sense that passing the Civil Rights Act and things like gay rights as well needed to happen because there were fundamental ideas at the heart of American history and of the American nation that actually meant that not passing those things, not having racial equality, not having sexual equality, would have been inconsistent with many of those kind of fundamental ideas.
Absolutely.
That's more of a liberal, that would be more of a sort of philosophical, like centrist liberal way of looking at it.
Right. But and again, to me, and of course, perspective bias, right? To me, it just makes sense. But it is true. And as we, I had brought up at the beginning about the on the table, off the table issues. For some reason, LGBTQ rights are being demolished all over many tables in different states across this country at this point. And it is interesting because most of the country really doesn't have a problem with LGBTQ rights or anything like that. So it's a very targeted thing that is going on, and it can only happen in places where we'll save how voting works in our separate countries for a different episode. That's a different episode.
That does remind me though of something that I did want to bring up. So first of all, there's one thing I do want to ask you about in a second about what you've just said. But before I forget, one thing I do think that we could talk about, we need to pay attention to one of the big things that's off the table for your country, but may start to become something that we talk about, is sort of the relative independence of the regions of the country. So states' rights in America is off the table. Like states have rights.
That's right. Yep.
So again, you will have to correct me on this if I'm wrong. But if, say, Georgia has one law, Texas has a different law, California has a different law, and they're all about the same thing, and they don't conform with each other, but they are all constitutional.
Yes.
That's fine. You can have that.
Yes. Abortion is a good example on that one. Because when Roe versus Wade got overturned, the Supreme Court's decision said, we're putting this into the states' rights. So states can make their own decisions about what they're going to do about this access. So the yes, the state I live in right now, Georgia and Texas, and of course California, all have very different laws concerning abortion access at this point. Let's just say if you need an abortion, you would want to be in California of the 3 states mentioned. So for whatever reason. But even in Texas and we actually brought this up in a previous episode of the podcast. There were 5 women in Texas that sued the state of Texas over the controversial abortion bans that had threatened their lives during very wanted pregnancies. So, it is a real problem. And yeah, that's the thing about states' rights here, is that, there's certain things that our federal government should be doing to make sure that, everybody, and especially pregnant women across the country, get the proper health care that they need. But it is an interesting thing. I mean, you guys have a different thing with abortion too, thoh, don't you?
Yeah, well,
you've explained this to me a little bit before.
Well, this is how I understand it. So I tried to do a little bit of research about this, but I didn't manage to find out as much as I wanted to. So I'm bear in mind I might be wrong about this, but my understanding is that if you want to have an abortion in England, you go through your doctor. But sort of 9 times out of 10, the doctor will then kind of refer you to the relevant person and you will have an abortion before. So it's not legal in as much as you can't just sort of walk into a facility and have it done.
Right.
But interestingly, you're probably more likely to be able to access it. Given what you've told me, given sort of the things I've read about, is one of the things I think we've talked about this before, but the Roe versus Wade, while it sort of guaranteed the right to an abortion, what it sort of guaranteed was that if you can access an abortion, then neither the person performing it will suffer any legal ramifications. But there's no guarantee that you will be able to access it.
Yeah, not necessarily. Although under Roe versus Wade, should you require the procedure, like, for example, abortions happen for really 2 reasons. One, it wasn't your choice to get pregnant, and therefore that's going to happen very, very early on. That's what you would call a choice of abortion. But after that, when it comes to what people would call like a late-term abortion or something like that, these are wanted pregnancies. No one's getting an abortion at 6 or 7 months pregnant because they decided they didn't want to have the baby. You don't go through that. Pregnancy is, I've never been pregnant, but I have plenty of people in my life that have been, and they will tell you it is the effect it has on your body, everything that goes on. You're not choosing to continue that just to flippantly decide later on, well, no, I've changed my mind. No, that's not what's going on. But that's what, certain conservatives in this country would have you believe.
Well, it's certainly like the message I get when I kind of listen to what the more kind of hard right American conservatives say is they almost seem to imply sometimes that it doesn't occur to the pregnant woman that she has a human life inside her, almost like they feel like she needs to be reminded of that. And what you're saying is that, like, no, she knows that, and they don't need to be reminded of that. And that but I think that's, I mean, where so going back to what we were talking about regarding the contrast between America and England, where this issue is concerned. I don't remember this issue ever being part of political discussions sort of in our parliament, at least around election time, right? I mean, it's not to say it's never been discussed at all. Of course it's been discussed, but it's never been on an election manifesto to my knowledge. Whereas in America, it seems as though it's something that could actually kind of be something that is expected of a right wing, or even it's difficult for me to say. I must say, it's difficult, as we were talking before we recorded, it's difficult to say right wing, because in America, like on the kind of objective scale, what you would call left wing, we would call centrist. You don't have left wing in the traditional sense, really. And then the right wing, you have sort of moderate right, which is actually quite moderate. And then, so people like sort of John McCain back in the day was relatively. And then you've got people right at the end of, you've got those ridiculous people who claim that a woman's body knows when she's been raped and it just shuts down.
Oh, yeah.
You remember, it's interesting that nearly every single one of them who claimed that was then voted out at the subsequent election.
Right.
Point
Thank
being,
goodness.
to my knowledge, you wouldn't find a Conservative member of Parliament making a claim like that, especially not around election time in England. And if they did, this party would say, we don't want you having anything to do with us, because we can't, this is not an issue for us. Whereas in America, the Republican Party seems a lot, how do I put this? It's less reluctant to distance itself from people who have those opinions.
Yeah, it's true. Because, I mean, let's face it, in England, you probably wouldn't have a potential candidate for prime minister being caught saying something like "grab him by the pussy,"
Well,
that
so
would
that's
just
an interesting
immediately be a disqualifier, I would think.
We have had our equivalent of that. I mean,
was it now, to be fair, the language could have been different, so it may not have caught to me, but what was it as bad as that?
I think objectively, I think it was not as bad. I don't think, but I mean, we're talking about Boris Johnson, and
yes, okay.
And I do not believe he was as bad as Trump, but there are things about him that sort of came out that suggested that he actually was worse. And this leads me, by the way, this isn't necessarily an on the table, off the table topic, but an interesting distinction, which we sort of slightly covered, is that arguably in America, when Trump was president, you guys didn't have it half as bad as you thought. And the reason is because, okay, so if you were living in a majority Republican state, or you were living in a city where the mayor is Republican and sympathetic to Trump, yeah, maybe you did have a problem. But like with sort of things like states' rights and a sort of relative independence of cities, you could have, like, Trump could say, this is what I want you all to do, and then states and cities can say nope, and they're perfectly fine. So if Trump decided, I know that he placed a ban on transgender people in the military. I still think that, like, it was the only reason why he would have done that would have been sort of as a kind of I hate this term, but it does seem correct to apply it. I sort of dog whistle to a very specific group of people who voted for him. But let's say he had said, I am going to make it illegal to be transgender in America. States could say, well, we're not going to do that. We're not going to. If they wanted to, they could say, well, we're not going to do that. And they could
some states are trying to do that.
They might try to, although I get the feeling that possibly, assuming I've got my amendments right, the 15th Amendment would make it difficult for them to do so. The one that sort of forbids discrimination on like various grounds. Is that the 15th Amendment?
Oh, gosh. Ha. I think you know our amendments better than I do.
Well, I don't, because I don't know.
I think you're but you might
I know
be
there
right.
is one, I don't know the exact word.
There is one somewhere about discrimination. We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
Because again, I'm no constitutional scholar. I know what's in there, but I can't necessarily remember exactly where it all is.
I'll bring it up while we're talking.
But yeah, it's interesting.
So my point is simply that
Yeah.
there's if Trump were to have done something that is really disastrous, there would sort of the powers of the states and the powers of the cities could mitigate that somewhat. Whereas in England, whatever the prime minister decides will be the law of the land is the law of the land. Although the prime minister himself doesn't decide, like the government does. But even still, we have no real power. Like the region of the country I live in at the moment, West Sussex it's called, we can't disobey the government. The law of England is our law, you know.
Right. So because England doesn't have, correct me if I'm wrong, you don't have like the state sort of setup that we do in this country, right? So I know you have your regions. You would you have your MPs that you can vote for in your district, right? But so does the north of England, or so it's you guys are still kind of almost, I guess, kind of like our House of Representatives. Like
it's exactly like that. It's exactly
okay, cool. All right.
Exactly like that. And by the way, I've just looked up the 15th Amendment, and we're sort of right and sort of wrong in that, yes, it sort of does that, but it only applies to the right to vote. But I mean, if
that's
they
why
said,
that
like,
one
okay,
raised in my head. Yeah.
So if Trump were to have said, like, transgender people don't have the right to vote, the 15th would have protected them. But the point is that but going back to what you just asked, yeah, basically, our parliament is sort of your House of Representatives, and the leader, let's say, like, each party has and let's say there's no other branch of government at all, and we have a House of Lords, but that's sort of somewhat different.
Right.
But if all you had in your country was your House of Representatives, and then each party had their own leader, and then the party members voted for the leader, so not the people of the country, but the party members, and then whichever party gets the most votes wins the most seats in the House, and then the leader automatically becomes prime minister. That's how it would work if you had the same system as ours. Right.
And okay, right. Because I know we've talked about this a little bit before, and it's kind of nice to lay it out, because while it is a different system, we do have our similarities.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, that was odd. I don't know what just happened there.
No, I don't know.
Well, this is part of the fun of figuring these things out.
It's just one of those things with Zoom that it just does that from time to time, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so, because yeah, I'm on my new computer. I'm excited about it. And we've had lovely reception the whole time, and then all of a sudden it just went, no. But I totally forgot what I was talking about before we got cut off.
So what I remember was we were starting, you'd asked me about, we were sort of talking a little bit about Boris Johnson and Trump, and then you asked me about the British Parliament, and I was telling you about the makeup of the Parliament and how it was like the House of Representatives.
Yeah, it's similar, and then but yes, in that case, with your Parliament system, is that your MPs are the ones who decide who the prime minister is going to be. Is that correct?
It's not quite. So it depends on the party.
Okay.
It depends on the political party.
Okay.
And they can kind of decide as and when. So, for example, the Labour Party decided, this was not to decide who the prime minister was, but there was one time when they decided to open up the vote to the public. And that was when we ended up with a sort of more left-wing Labour leader who wasn't the Prime Minister, called Jeremy Corbyn.
Oh, okay.
Additionally, so we've had, and you may have been
name.
following the British news, I don't know, but in the last year, we've had 3 different prime ministers.
I did notice that part, yes.
We've had 2 leadership elections. What tends to happen is the way the Conservatives do it, they'll nominate individuals to stand for the leadership, and then the MPs will vote, and it's a runoff election if there's more than 2 candidates. And then when it narrows it down to 2, when there's only 2 candidates left, they open it up to the whole of the party. So if you're like a paid up member of the Conservative Party, once there are 2 candidates, then you get to vote on who you want to be the leader.
Oh, okay.
And only the MPs vote at first, so until there are 2 candidates. The actual leadership election is all the members of the party. But what this means, of course, is that if for whatever reason a prime minister stands down or leaves office, the next prime minister will be chosen by the party, not by the people.
Right.
The idea being that the prime minister was never chosen by the people. The party was chosen by the people. The government was chosen.
So is that what happened with Liz Truss? Because she was essentially ousted, right?
She was deeply unpopular already.
Yeah.
It's arguable. I mean, this is one of those things that historians will probably debate for years to come, and I don't know the exact parts of this, but our understanding is that she became the favourite in the party to become, so the favourite among MPs to become Prime Minister was Rishi Sunak. But because he had been the Chancellor to Boris Johnson, I'm trying to think of your equivalent of like what would the person in charge of the economy?
Oh, that would be our Treasury Secretary.
Yeah, so that's our
Janet Yellen.
What we call the Chancellor of the Exchequer is our equivalent of your what do you call it again? Something of the Treasury.
I think it would be the Treasury Secretary.
So yeah, okay. So
referring
they're
to
the kind of second in command. They're the one that organises the budget.
Right.
They oversee the budget, and Rishi Sunak had been Chancellor to Boris Johnson, and I think a lot of people in the party saw him as too close to Johnson, and so Truss ended up getting the initial victory. But in a very short space of time, she made a number of decisions that caused an awful lot of problems.
I saw that.
But a lot of economic, sort of short and long-term economic impact, short term, of course, mainly. And so she was forced to step down after about a month, I think. And I think she remained being Prime Minister. And then the only real person left was Rishi Sunak. So he ended up in a leadership election. And I think somebody stood against him, but I'm not sure. And then he ended up as Prime Minister. He probably should have been the one who won in the first place. He was more competent.
Right. And well, I did see, as I mentioned to you before we started recording today, I didn't catch all of it. But Prime Minister Sunak was here doing a press conference with President Biden, and they had a pretty interesting conversation from what I caught of it. And again, as we mentioned earlier, I thought it was kind of interesting because I know your current prime minister is considered to be what we would call at least a maybe moderate conservative.
Yeah.
And our president is considered to be, just a bit left to center, really. I mean, President Biden is not wildly liberal. But it seemed that they had a really good conversation. And I thought that was really interesting because talking about issues that are maybe difficult to put on the table they were talking about the war in Ukraine, and um, I thought the prime minister's comments were pretty interesting. Because he acknowledged, and I don't know, this this is definitely not going to be politically correct to say. Maybe I'll cut it out. I don't know. We'll see how it plays. But it was sort of like he was kind of playing up to Biden. I was going to use different language there. Okay, I can keep that in a little bit. But
Biden has decades of experience on Zoom.
Exactly.
I think Sunak's barely been an MP for very long. I think he was elected in 2015, maybe.
Yeah.
It's rare that someone can kind of rise to the top job so quickly.
Well, to be fair, that was the case for President Obama.
Well, Blair to a certain extent as well. It took him about 10 years.
Yeah, and so, every now and then there's a rock star that sneaks through, I think, whether you agree with them or not.
It took about 3 or 4 years, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I found the conversation interesting, but I did think that if what the prime minister was saying, it was really genuine and not just for show, it sounds like he's actually, pretty genuine about continuing the long-standing legacy of the unity between our two countries, that kind of thing, which is always kind of funny. I mean, yeah, we're, our two countries have been allies for ages, well, except for that, first bit where we ran away and then I couldn't help but make that joke. Sorry.
It's interesting that I've been trying to sort of read up a little bit about that period in American history and in world history. There's a lot of conflicting views about it. I myself don't know enough to be able to say one way or the other, but I've certainly read some people who argue that sort of at the time of the American Revolution, the War of Independence, one of the reasons was because King George III of England was very against slavery. The Americans wanted to preserve the institution of slavery. Who fought the British in order to preserve the institution of slavery. But
and
then,
we were always taught taxation without representation. That's what we were taught.
One of the things about history is we have a tendency to simplify it.
Oh, of course.
So if you said it's all about taxation and I said it's all about slavery, we'd probably both be wrong. But there would have been.
But we might also both be correct. We might both be correct. It could have been about both of those things.
But that's sort of the point, is that usually if it is just about one issue, it's usually a lot easier to sort it out. Because you just sort of say, well, we know what the issue is. And so we're either we know that's the only thing on the table. So for example, it might be, we were just talking about Joe Biden meeting Rishi Sunak. It might be that one of the reasons that they were able to have a productive conversation was because it was very clear what it was for them to talk about.
Right.
Couple that with the fact that, if you're the leader of any democratic nation in the world, then if you're talking to another leader of another democratic nation, then all you have to do is sort of bear in mind the fact that they have been fairly elected. So if you respect their democracy, then you can get along with their leader, whoever they are. So for example, Sunak and Biden might not see ideologically eye to eye over everything, but they clearly respect democracy, and they clearly, and if Biden respects British democracy and Sunak respects American democracy, then they can work with each other.
Well, folks, thanks to some stormy internet disruptions, that's all we have for you today. So thank you to Alastair for joining me again, and we're looking forward to more of our future collaborations. And thanks so much to all of our listeners. We have a lot more of this conversation to share with you guys, so we will be getting that to you next week. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share on YouTube and Spotify.